It is summer of 1945. World War II has just ended. In this alternate history scenario, the Cold War between the Western Allies and the USSR starts immediately and escalates to an actual war, almost right after the defeat of Japan. The Allies actually had plans for exactly such a war before World War II ended, fearing the Soviets. This video goes further, pondering both sides' capabilities. How would such early World War III go, and who would be the winner? Let's go back to our hypothetical war. In the real timeline, in April, American troops made the first contact with the Red Army on the river Elba in Germany, effectively cutting in half what remained of the German territories. In May, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. But even in 1945, there were those like the US General George S. Patton who thought that the Soviet Union was as big of a threat as Germany. Patton saw the push of the Red Army into Germany not as an Allied victory, but as an expansion of Soviet Union deep into Central Europe. Then there was Operation Unthinkable, first proposed in 1945 by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This plan examined the possibility of a preemptive attack by the British and US troops on the Red Army. The plan proposed a surprise attack by up to 47 British and American divisions in the area of Dresden, in the middle of Soviet lines. However, British Chiefs of Staff Committee declared the plan to be unfeasible, estimating that the Red Army troops had a numerical advantage of 2.5 to 1. Later, Churchill demanded a follow-up study analyzing the possibility of a Soviet attack on Western Europe, after the US withdrew its troops to defeat Japan. In that case, the study claimed the Red Army could easily conquer all of Europe, with Britain surviving only because of its naval and air forces. All those plans stem from the fear of the Soviet Union, which was there much earlier. There was a plan called Operation Pike, developed early in the war after the Soviet Union and Germany signed the Treaty of Non-Aggression in 1939. Operation Pike was a strategic bombing plan targeting Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, from air bases in Iran. Its proponents reasoned that such an attack might prevent Stalin from providing Germany with much-needed oil, while also seriously hampering the Soviet economy. In his book Downfall 1945, Steven Zaloga sets the number of the Western Allied military personnel in Western Europe at over 5 million, with over 3 million of them being Americans. Little over a million more were operating in Italy close to the end of the war. While planning the Operation Unthinkable, British Chiefs of Staff Committee badly overestimated the number of Soviet forces. A large portion of any military personnel is support personnel that does not deploy to front lines. Plus, both Allies and the USSR had the Far East front line to worry over, due to just ended war with Japan. The European region saw rough parity in numbers when it comes to troops deployed near the front line. As said, the Pacific Theater commandeered additional forces, and Soviets funneled some of their European forces to attack Japan after Germany fell. When it comes to hardware, two things Soviets did have more of than the Allies were tanks and artillery. Though almost all Allied tanks were stationed in Europe, while a little upward of 5,000 of the shown figure for the Soviets was near Japanese-controlled Manchuria. The artillery figures are a bit less precise due to different classification by different sources on two different sides. The US provided roughly 2/3 of the overall Allied figures for tanks and artillery, and little over half of the aircraft figure for the European theater. While Soviet figures represent most of their aircraft, the US did have a large chunk of combat aircraft back home and in the Pacific, as well as the Navy aircraft to count on. As for the naval forces, Allied warships dominated the world seas, as Soviet Union had but a token naval presence. Soviets poured their resources into their ground army to fight the Germans during the war, while ocean-going capabilities for their navy were not a priority. It isn't hard to imagine a war breaking out between the Western Allies and the Red Army. Initial skirmishes caused by accident or mutual distrust might soon spiral into battles and finally war. Those skirmishes might even be deliberately caused as a pretext for a full-blown offensive against a former ally. At least at first, the tactical advantage would go to the attacker, especially if the offensive manages to catch the opponent unprepared. The first months of this new war would most likely center on Germany, with one side trying to push the other out of the country. The Red Army might try to force the Western Allies back to France across the River Rhine. If successful, Soviets might even try to launch an offensive through France and the Low Countries, pushing the Western Allies back to the Atlantic shore. On the other hand, a quick and decisive Allied attack, led even perhaps by General Patton, could force the Red Army out of Germany and maybe even out of Poland. We also mustn't forget Allied troops in Italy. The Alps, as well as Swiss neutrality, would make it hard for those troops to reach the main battlefront in Germany if war caught them off guard. The Western Allies could try and regroup in northern Italy. From there, they could try to move the troops by land and by sea towards France and join the main bulk of Allied forces. Alternatively, Allied troops could also try to mount a counteroffensive through Austria and attack the southern flank of the main Soviet forces. In 1945, Austria was carved up by its liberators and de facto occupied. It's likely it would get used as a battleground without its consent. Using some of the force projections for the Operation Unthinkable and actual force numbers in the summer of 1945, the Allies could count on some 80 infantry and 23 armored divisions in Europe, while the Soviets in Europe could rely on 230 infantry and 36 armored divisions. Of course, the units on either side are not directly comparable. Allied divisions tended to have 50% more troops nominally, and on the actual battlefield both sides had fewer, with Soviets sometimes having just half of the number of nominal troops in a division. All the numbers do include various Allied troops, such as the French, Polish or Romanian troops. They do not include potential German troops though. The Allies did have more troops in the support echelons per each frontline soldier, which is why even though overall personnel numbers were only slightly in favor of the Soviets, as shown previously, the actual Soviet frontline troop numbers would be anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times bigger than those of the Western Allies. It's hard to imagine this war ending by the winter of 1945. The front lines with so many troops in such a small area simply don't move so quickly. We have historical examples of just a year earlier. Operation Bagration was a huge Soviet push towards Germany in 1944. The Soviets already had considerable advantage in hardware, experience and manpower then. It took them almost 2 months to advance 100 to 200 miles. And then 9 more months against even weaker Germans as the front line narrowed towards Berlin to actually enter the city. Western Allies weren't any quicker either. They took a month and a half once they started their push into Germany over the River Rhine to move the front line by on average 200 miles. And they had a better ratio of manpower and hardware against Germans too. Covering 500 miles in mere months is simply not feasible, and that's the distance the Soviets would need to drive the Allies back to Paris, or for the Allies to drive the Soviets to Warsaw. Large offensives simply need time to be prepared. Even if Soviets somehow scored military victories throughout 1945 and pushed the Western Allies back towards the sea, the Allies would still have naval superiority and secure air bases in Britain, Norway, Italy and south of France. Chances for the ultimate Soviet victory would decrease dramatically the closer the Red Army got to the Atlantic and the North Sea. On the other hand, even if the Western Allies somehow pushed the Red Army out of Poland, they would still have to wage a long war of attrition and maybe even face a daunting prospect of an invasion of the Soviet Union. And we all know what happened when Germany tried that. Long supply lines for the advancing side, when the defender enjoys short supply lines, can significantly impact the course of battle, or at least speed of advance. More support per soldier for the Allies would have made faster advance a bit easier, in theory, but the sheer congestion of troops in such a relatively small area would make that a moot point, and also blunt any armored edge or hopes of a fast push through enemy lines. There simply would not be room for a weak part of the front line, for one side to go through and encircle the enemy. So the Soviet tank edge could not really be exploited. Allied edge in air power would also mess with Soviet tanks and artillery, and would partially compensate for the fewer artillery pieces the Allies would use, but would perhaps be most useful in disrupting the Soviet supply lines just behind the front line, which would make Soviet advances even harder. To bolster their forces, the Western Allies might even try recruiting their former enemies. After all, German leadership saw the Soviet Union as their primary threat. Even at the end of the war, some of Germany hoped that the US and Britain might ally themselves with Germany and attack the Soviets. But using German forces in a war against the Soviet Union would have been a risky idea. Not everyone would have been willing to fight alongside their former enemies. As seen in plans for Operation Unthinkable, Allies at the time did hope they could muster at least 10 German divisions, or at best some 700,000 German troops to fight for them. The Pacific Theater would be an afterthought for both sides. The US would keep some of its 20-something divisions around Japan and perhaps try to tie Soviet troops to the Far East with the remaining divisions, but actually attacking Vladivostok would be unlikely. Soviets would simply lack the hardware to even attempt any overseas invasion of Japan. Perhaps the island of Sakhalin and the southern tip of Kamchatka Peninsula might eventually fall to the US, if the US would want to endure higher casualties than the Soviets there, and it would still not really influence the main European war theater. What happens in 1946 and beyond would likely be determined not by the armies or the commanders, but by the strength of industrial production and the stability of supply lines. The vastness of Eastern Europe worked both for and against the Red Army. Early in the war, the Soviet Union successfully transported entire factories beyond Ural Mountains. However, supplying Soviet troops remained a problem. Railways were a vulnerable bottleneck since there were relatively few of them in the Soviet Union and Poland. A successful bombing campaign targeting these railways would make the resupply of the Red Army much harder. The Soviet Union might try to rebuild factories in the conquered territories of Central Europe, but to do so, the Soviets would first have to repair destroyed infrastructure and pacify hostile populations, all the while battling the Western Allies. Western Allies were sending military aid to the Soviet Union during World War II via the Lend-Lease program. By the time Germany fell, almost all of the aid reached the Soviets, so cutting the program in the summer of 1945 would not do much for the Allies. In a sense, the Allies would have made it harder for themselves to fight the Soviets, because of all the Lend-Lease help. When it comes to supplying and production, the Western Allies would be in a much better position. They controlled the sea lanes and could transport troops and supplies over the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea with ease. The Soviet Navy would be mostly locked in. It's plausible Allied navies would even shrink, so part of their resources go into the air forces and the army, if the war lasts long enough to make such a switch feasible. The entire Great Britain served as a giant staging area for the attacks on the European continent. As for the civilian population in Western and possibly Central Europe, they would probably be happier to be occupied by the Western Allies than by Stalin's Red Army. Together, these two factors would give the Western Allies an advantage in this war and might even tip the balance of power in their favor. And this is before we even consider nuclear weapons. By the summer of 1945, the US successfully detonated the first atomic bomb. 2 were ready for use and a third one was being assembled. Up to 12 more bombs were readied for production by November 1945. It is likely, had a war against the Soviets occurred, that production would have gone on, and possibly another dozen could have been ready by early 1946. It would have made sense for the Western Allies to use this limited number of new superweapons on the Soviet Union. Back then, it was just another, albeit massive, bomb. Indeed, some of the British plans for Operation Unthinkable warranted some 20 US bombs dropped on various Soviet targets. Western Allies could try crippling the Soviet war effort by dropping nukes on important oil industry cities around the Caucasus, like Baku. They might also try targeting really important cities like Moscow, even though it would have been much harder to reach, both due to distance and heavy defenses. But reaching so deep into Soviet Union would mean many casualties, as fighter escorts would lack numbers. More nuclear bombs than not would likely get lost on such a route. Turkey would also be an interesting staging ground for the war. Historically, it was somewhat closer to the Western Allies at that moment in time, but it's impossible to say just how neutral it would remain. Trying to nuke the Soviet forces near the battlefield would be possible, but perhaps not worth it, except for morale-shattering purposes. A 20-kiloton bomb, like one dropped on Nagasaki, would scorch an unsheltered person with a direct line of sight to the detonation point up to some 2 kilometers away. Many soldiers would, however, enjoy some shelter, and troops in various vehicles would likely be safe even if at 1 kilometer away. Even less for tank crews. Given the number of Soviet divisions and the length and depth of the front, it's likely roughly a half a division to a full division could be neutralized with a single bomb. Achieving that every few weeks would be a big blow to Soviets, but not a debilitating one. In general, the Soviet Union lagged behind the Western Allies in technology. While Soviets did experiment with radar even before the war, the Red Army got really interested in radar technology only after Germany attacked Soviet Union in 1941. By the end of World War II, first British and US jet fighters were already entering service. It took Soviet Union another 3 years to introduce its first jet fighters. First Soviet nuclear bomb, whose design was very similar to the US Fatboy plutonium bomb, was detonated in 1949. Soviet scientists used their knowledge along with the information gathered by spies and reverse-engineered German, British and US technology to close the technological gap by the late 1940s. However, while a new war with the Western Allies would have provided additional incentive to introduce and develop new weapons, it would have also put an additional strain on the Soviet industry and economy. Soviet production effort during World War II was massive, but it still lagged behind the Allied one. Had both sides had to keep such total war production going on, it's likely the Allies would have found it somewhat easier to keep it up. Here's just an example of numbers of produced tanks and planes for period of 1943 through 1945 to illustrate the point of their production potentials. One has to take into account the lack of Lend-Lease production burden on Allies and the reshuffling of the resources going into production now that Allies don't need to upkeep such massive navies. In the end, even with nuclear weapons, a war between the US and the USSR would have been long and bloody. How long? Western Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944. Even as Germany faced the most powerful armies of the time on two separate fronts at the same time, it nevertheless took Allies almost a full year to defeat it. A similar war waged between the Western Allies and the USSR would pit two immensely powerful armies on a unified front across the entire continent. In case it manages to stage a surprise offensive, the Red Army might be able to catch the Allies off guard and push them closer to the Atlantic, but it wouldn't be able to keep them there. Western Allies would likely force the Soviets back to eastern Poland eventually, but attacking the Soviet Union itself would be a disaster, both in lives lost and economy pushed to the brink. It's likely both the US and Britain would suffer several times higher casualties than they suffered in World War II if a push towards Moscow is attempted. The Allies might even break apart politically, faced with such losses right after World War II. Both sides would have been too powerful to fall and too weak to strike a quick killing blow. Meanwhile, this new war would have destroyed what little remained of European infrastructure after 6 years of war, resulting in scores of new refugees. In the end, Western Allies would likely prevail due to their nuclear, economical and manpower edge. In the 4 years of battling Germans, the Soviet Union lost up to 10 million soldiers and another 10 to 16 million civilians. Soviet industry and infrastructure were repeatedly destroyed, first by the Red Army when it retreated in 1941 and later again by Germans when they were pushed out of Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Western Allies had a strong and secure industrial base. US territory was virtually untouched by enemy attacks. Thanks to the British colonies, Western Allies had raw materials from most of the world at their disposal. Thanks to the US and British navies, Western Allies controlled the world seas. Due to all that and the nuclear weapons, the Red Army would probably eventually leave Central Europe, either pushed out by the Western armies or retreating behind the Soviet border after agreeing to some kind of a truce. In either case, reaching that stalemate would have been a long and bloody affair, leaving little behind except for a ruined continent. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.